Hello, my name is Svetlana Peshkova. I'm an associate professor of anthropology and a core member in Women and Gender Studies department. I'm also a current coordinator of the Native American and Indigenous Studies minor. And I would like to welcome you to the series honoring the mother of all people, contemporary Indigenous leadership in revitalizing environmental and cultural sustainability. The organizers and participants would like to thank the SIDOR or the Solstidor Memorial Lecture Series, the Center for the Humanities, the Indigenous New Hampshire Collaborative Collective for preparation of this event. The SIDOR or the Solstidor Memorial Lecture Series was established in 1965 in memory of Sol Osidor of Manchester, New Hampshire. The purpose of the series is to offer the university community and the state of New Hampshire various programs which raise critical and sometimes controversial issues facing our society. The University of New Hampshire Center for the Humanities sponsors these programs. Today's panel is the first event in the series. All panelists of the event are members of the Indigenous New Hampshire Collaborative Collective. You can see the chat box for the link. I would like to remind everyone in the audience that this event is being recorded and will be available for the later viewing on the Center for the Humanities website. You can see in the chat box the link for the website. Audience members' cameras and mics have been turned off by the host. At the bottom of your screen, there is a button that says Q&A. Please feel free to send in your questions as they come up. You do not need to wait until the end of the event. Our panelists will answer questions from the audience toward the end of the program. I would like to introduce Paul and Denise Pouliot for a land acknowledgement. Denise Pouliot is a Sagamasquaw or female head speaker of the Cowasuck band of the Pennacook Abenaki people, a traditional artist, a federal religious advisor, and currently serves on the New Hampshire Commission of Native American Affairs. She is also a founding member of the Indigenous New Hampshire Collaborative Collective, an affiliate faculty member of the UNH Native American and Indigenous Studies minor, and is the treasurer for Koasek, North America, and the Abenaki Nation of Vermont. Paul Pouliot has been the Sagamore or chief speaker for the Cowasuck band of the Pennacook and Abenaki people and president of the Koasek North America and the Abenaki Nation of Vermont since 1990. Paul is an Indigenous historian, lecturer, federal religious advisor, and a founding member of the Indigenous New Hampshire Collaborative Collective. He is also an affiliate faculty member of the UNH Native American and Indigenous Studies minor and a founding member of the New Hampshire Commission of Native American Affairs. Without further ado, Paul and Denise, please.
Hello, friends. This presentation takes place on Dakina, or New Hampshire, and also a little bit in the Creek Reservation in Oklahoma. New Hampshire is the traditional ancestral homelands and waterways of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples of the past and present. We acknowledge and honor with gratitude the land and waterways and our ancestors, the Almanbach, or human beings, who have stewarded Dakina throughout the generations.
Hello, my name is Alex Martin. I'm an affiliate faculty member of the Anthropology Department at UNH and a core faculty member of the Native American and Indigenous Studies minor. With this first event in the series, we'd like to highlight the new Native American and Indigenous Studies minor. This is an interdisciplinary program that offers a broad understanding of the history, lands, culture, literature, language and artistic expression, science and technology, race, identity, and political statuses of Native American and Indigenous people of North America and beyond. The Gateway NAIS class, next offered January term, introduces the complexity and diversity of Indigenous experiences and heritage through a variety of articles, books, and media by Indigenous scholars. You can find out more information about the minor at the link provided in the chat. Now, Dr. Peshkova will introduce our moderator.
The moderator for today's panel is Daniel Howard. Daniel Howard is an assistant professor of ecology, evolution, and behavior in the Department of Biological Sciences at UNH and the associate director of education for the UNH Center for Acoustics Research and Education. He conducts research on animal communication, neuroethology, and environmental acoustics. Dan is an enrolled citizen of both the Cherokee Nation and Shawnee tribe, and is a member of the New Hampshire Commission on Native American Affairs. Welcome, Dan.
Wado, Lana, welcome everybody, OCO. I'd like to now take a few minutes and introduce you to our panel today. If the panelists would turn their camera on for just a moment here, I'll start with Kathleen. Kathleen Blake is an Indigenous grandmother, a councilwoman and spiritual leader of the Koasek traditional band of the sovereign Abenaki Nation, and a retired science teacher and school administrator. Kathleen is the chair of the New Hampshire Commission on Native American Affairs, an alumna of UNH and Plymouth State University, and an affiliate member of the UNH Native American and Indigenous Studies minor. Welcome, Kathleen. James Edgell Jr. is Mohawk Micmac and Micmac Newmarket Chick Wabanaki relation. He's an alumnus of Keene State College and UNH Upward Bound and holds a master's degree in project management from Granite State College. He's a U.S. Marines disabled American veteran. James is a former chief of the New Hampshire Intertribal Council, a former advisor of UNH's Native American Cultural Association, is an information technology team leader here at UNH. Welcome, James. And Anne Jennison is a traditional Native American storyteller of European and Abenaki heritage, a grandmother, a co-creator of the People of the Dawnland Abenaki exhibit at Strawberry Bank Museum in Portsmouth, a member of the New Hampshire Commission on Native American Affairs, an alumna of UNH and Lesley University, an affiliate faculty member of the UNH Native American and Indigenous Studies minor, and a retired history teacher. Welcome, Anne. And you all have met already Denise and Paul Pouliot. So welcome and thank you, panelists, for agreeing to serve today. I'd like to start my role as moderator by asking you all a series of questions. And the first question I would really like to ask is, who are the Indigenous people of the region that we know today as Seacoast, New Hampshire? And perhaps, Paul, you wouldn't mind starting out by answering this question.
Our question was, who are the Indigenous people here of the Seacoast of New Hampshire? As a tribal group, we get this question on a regular basis because of a continued colonial misconception that every Indigenous location was occupied by a different or distinct tribal group. We are the Wabanaki, or the ancient people of the Dawnlands. In our language, the root word is Waban. It's described as the place where the first white rays of the sun, or the aurora, as they sometimes call it, comes upon our lands, the Nakina, Turtle Island, or is now called North America. Within our own culture, we have always called ourselves Elnambak, or human beings. So the question is always raised, what do you call yourselves today? And who lived here in New Hampshire? There's a good explanation for calling us the Wabanaki, Abenaki, or Pennacook. Indigenous groups are often named by other Indigenous peoples or colonial contexts. In our case, the Lenape, the Delaware, call themselves the grandparents of the ancient Algonquin, but they called us the Wabanakiak, or their ancient ancestors that were here before them, or in other words, their paleo ancestors that were here from the time of the ice ages. This statement has been substantiated in the records of those first Jesuits in the Lenape that encountered us through their oral traditions. Unfortunately, in the late 1800s, the Smithsonian Bureau of Ethnology created taxonomies of indigenous peoples. Over 60 place name identifications were given for describing us as a people. These place names identities were used to create a paradigm to divide us culturally and politically into smaller tribalistic factions. When we discuss place name constructs, we need to think about today. We live in states, counties, cities, towns, and neighborhoods. This was much the same for us in the past. We lived in several locations and possibly as many as 5 annually. We moved around from villages of various sizes to seasonal food gathering camps for hunting, fishing, gardening, and other gathering. Governance of our communities was based on extended families and clans that were held together by strong matriarchal relations. So moving about within our peoples was as natural as visiting your own relations. In summary, we, the Wabanaki, have been here for thousands of years and continue to live here. We were never forced to relocate to other lands or reservations. We often moved within our homelands, which include a very large landmass that covered most of northeastern United States and Canada, including much of Quebec, all of New Hampshire, most of western Maine, most of Vermont, and northern portions of Massachusetts. However, since colonial contact and domination, we have been in a survival mode. We have preserved and persevered by assimilation and acculturation while continuing to maintain our traditional lifeways and culture within an occupied homeland of Mundakina, which is now called New Hampshire.
Thank you, Paul. That was very informative. I appreciate your remarks. I want to ask, maybe I'll kick this question to Kathleen. Based on what Paul just shared with us, are there some prevailing stereotypes about local Indigenous people from this region of the Northeast that you could maybe share with us?
Absolutely, Dan. Thinking about this, I think that the most interesting thing that I've heard, and I'm going to share things that I've actually had people say to me individually, is that Native American people never lived in New Hampshire. What it was said was that people lived in Vermont, they lived in Maine, and they walked back and forth against New Hampshire, but never lived here, which is absolutely false. We've been here for over 12,000 years. Another thing that I've heard is that all the Indians have disappeared. They're all gone. They don't exist anymore. Yet here we are. I've also heard that some people consider Indigenous mascots to be honoring of us. And the mascots really look like our Northeast Woodlands peoples. And that is absolutely false. There is not any honoring in a Native American mascot. I've also heard people say, you're nothing but a bunch of savages. There's a whole lot of history that needs to be shared and needs to be taught, because that's obviously not the truth. I've had people say, you people massacred my ancestors. And again, the real history of this land and what happened with the Indigenous and the Europeans needs to be taught. Denise, could you share some more light on this question?
Sure, Kathleen. All these stereotypes and misrepresentations are in direct conflict with the recorded historical facts. The Jesuit missionaries were sent here to study the Abenaki, to record our language, traditions, belief system, culture, and ways. The purpose of this research was to discover how to manipulate our ancestors in order to convert them to Christianity. Father Eugene Vitramiel compiled and published many of those manuscripts and diaries. In those writings, the Abenaki were described as pious, righteous, and deeply spiritual. We are monotheistic, meaning we worshiped one God. We were fully clothed, not like the other regional tribes. We maintained a strong matriarchal society. We were multilingual, speaking French, English, Latin, among all the other indigenous languages we had already spoken, understood Christianity and debated and interpreted the Bible, and we maintained a consensus decision-making process. Father Vitremil asserted that their sentiments and principles of justice had no parallel among other tribes, and that they were never known to have been treacherous nor wanting in honor or conscience in fulfilling their word or given even in public or in private treaty. While we may properly regard this as too great praise, we must admit that they possess the nobility of character remarkable in a savage people. It is certain that the missionaries found them more tractable and more ready to listen to their teachings than any other branch of the Algonquin family from which they came in contact. Although dignified and taciturn in council and among strangers, when free from restraint, they were social and always ready to join in amusements among themselves. Both men and women were uniformly described as being modest, and perhaps the most remarkable thing to be recorded in favor of the Abenaki warrior is the fact that no female prisoner ever had any occasion to complain of him in any respect. Vitremil's records the important fact that Abenakis, and they alone of the Algonquin family, possess the art of a wikigan, which is handwriting. Vitremil also gives examples which strikingly reminds one of the ancient phonetic script of Egypt and Phoenicia. He further states that the people were accustomed to send missives to one another written upon birch bark, and the chiefs to dispatch written circulars of the same material to their warriors, asking for advice. Indeed, the Abenaki asserted that their method of writing expressed ideas as fully and as freely as that employed by the Europeans. As this Jesuit record is clear, the manipulation that is called history being taught here in the United States has been focused on destroying indigenous communities in order to justify the theft of indigenous lands and resources. It is crucial that we decolonialize our educational system and begin telling the inclusive history of this nation if we are to ever truly become a nation of one people. In order to have a common future, we must have an inclusive past.
Thank you for your remarks, Denise and Kathleen, both. I think you both presented kind of a nice snapshot of both some historical and current issues that we can potentially talk a little bit more about. But Anne, I've got a question for you. Are there some, we've talked about traditional things and some historical things happening. Do you see some factors that actually act to suppress or have it suppressed or continue to suppress Indigenous ways of life in New England broadly, and New Hampshire more specifically?
I do. Thank you for asking. I think at this point, it all comes back to education and the need to educate people about the relationships, not only amongst the Abenaki themselves, but since the colonial period, the ongoing pattern that has developed. When the English first came to New Hampshire, that was to settle the settlers and colonists, that was 1623. In France, which is the northern edge of Abenaki territory, New France, Canada, Quebec was settled in 1608. So very early on, the English settlers in Massachusetts Bay and in New Hampshire were needing of land and negotiating to acquire more land. Up in New France, up in Canada, the first settlers were coming in the 1600s, but that wasn't our first contact. The first contact happened here in the 1500s, the mid to late 1500s. So there's been a long, long history of interaction between the Abenaki peoples, first with the European colonists and settlers, explorers, colonists and settlers, and then later on, the new United States, continuing up through today. And what happened initially is that the Abenaki got caught in a pincher move between, in the imperial struggles between England and France over who is going to control this part of what we think of now as the United States and southeastern Canada. And so there was about 50 years of peace, and then war started because every generation of Europeans, the new generation of sons, needed more land for farming and moved in and were displacing the Abenaki peoples, causing tension between the people where they already were and the Abenaki people who needed to move into that space. So about 50 years in, a series of wars started that continued off and on between the English and the French, and then between the English and the American colonists. So these wars were intermittent, but some of them very long, 10, 12 years long, for 100 years till the end of the American Revolution. At that point, the relationship with the new United States created all kinds of new tensions. The population of Americans was growing. There was a large percentage and growing population of unlanded, uneducated settlers, descendants of, early European colonist settlers, but also, natural increase, and also people still coming over from Europe. So it's always a pushing the indigenous people further and further north, in our case, and also west. So then it got to the point where, under Andrew Jackson's administration, the Indian Act of 1830 was written, which was to remove all indigenous peoples, all Native American peoples, from east of the Mississippi River to west, and particularly into Oklahoma. So we're very familiar, I think, with the situation of the 5 civilized tribes, civilized I put in quotes, down south, and the history of the Trail of Tears and the Cherokee. But it's dropped off, I think, the educational radar, that this really impacted all of the indigenous peoples in the Northeast. And I've seen it in my own family and my husband's family, this phenomenon that actually a paper that I came across in the 1990s when I was in graduate school by Marge Bruchac, who now teaches, Dr. Bruchac is, I think, at the University of Pennsylvania, teaching anthropology. But back then, it was a questioning about hiding in plain sight, and how difficult it was for Abenaki people today to establish their identity as Abenaki people, because we got so good at hiding in plain sight. And that phenomenon meant Abenaki people moving further and further away of centers of American population, further away from the cities up into the northern woods. Or if there had been intermarriage, if one happened to look more Black or more white, it was better to be Black or white than to be Abenaki or of any Native American ancestry here in the Northeast. If people wanted to get, in my own family, with my great-grandfather, his mother was Abenaki. I knew him. He was born in 1875. His mother was Abenaki. To me, that's touching, that's living history. I knew him till I was about 10 years old. He didn't speak outside of the family of, our Native heritage, that portion of our heritage. If you wanted to have a job, to have your children have an education, to be in peace with your neighbors, then you kept your mouths quiet and you didn't tell the children so they wouldn't take it to school. So then one generation after another started growing up with that story about having had, Abenaki heritage, but not really fully understanding their own history, just knowing that it was there, but it still wasn't safe. I started telling stories in public in the early 90s, late 80s, early 90s, when my daughters were born. And I actually went to my parents and asked them, is this going to be all right now? If I go out, if I go into schools or what have you, and acknowledge my Indigenous heritage, because, somebody's going to notice that at least one of you are also Indigenous. Is that all right? And it was, things unfold in their time. My mother is 93 now, and she's so happy because I have spent 30 plus years learning more about the Abenaki people, and everything that I find, that I know, reinforces what she heard, what she learned from her grandfather when back in the 1930s.
So that brings up a good point. I love the comment you made about hiding in plain sight. And I really appreciate kind of the historical backdrop that you provide us about the Abenaki here in New Hampshire, New England. So that brings up another question, and then maybe I'll launch this one to James, if you don't mind answering this. It's about some of the stereotypes and some of the misconceptions that people have here in the Northeast. do you think those types of stereotypes and misconceptions actually have an effect on the life of contemporary Abenaki people here in New Hampshire?
Yeah, I do, Dan Sago. They have a really direct and indirect impact. Really, when you're talking about harmful stereotypes, it really comes in layers. And I'll speak from experience. My grandmother, when she used to tell me about the reservation, First Nations reservation up in Canada, she would say, Jimmy, we were just Indians. And really what that means as a stereotype, back in, the 1920s and 30s and 40s and that period of, when she was a young girl up there, a teenager, it's when you're just an Indian, you don't have these rights. And from that comes certain stereotypes, like when we were driving in a car when I was young, a police officer pulled over on my mother and asked her for her license. And you may know this as well. I don't know if they still do it today, but on my mother's license said it's American Indian on the license. So they used to put it right on your license. And, us young kids were in the car, and the next thing you know, they're dragging my mom out of the car and beating her up. And another example is when I was in the 6th grade, I was leaving to go to the bathroom from my class, and there was a group of teachers in the hall, and I was walking by, and they're like, oh, there's Jimmy Edgell. He's not going to make it like the rest of them. They're Indians. And for me, that had a real strong impact. And I went into the 7th grade, actually, failing for half the year, except for Jim. And it was some great teachers there in junior high and high school that really looked beyond that and really took an interest and really helped me. But that was as a kid in the 6th grade, that was really tough to hear. And the Indian stereotypes kind of transfers over to really, what are you doing here? So the big kids used to wait on a corner in the 1st grade when I went to school, and they used to call me, the nickname for me was Bald Eagle effing Indian. And they used to yell at me when they were chasing me, go back to where you belong. And I couldn't really understand that. I was like, back to where I belong. It really confused me. I didn't understand why they were saying that. And a group of kids came up to me when I was a little bit older and said, you're Mohawks. What are you doing here? And then another kid said, oh, they're related to the Chicks, a Wabanaki family in Newmarket. And then he goes, oh, I get it now. It's an Indian thing. And then at work, a gentleman about 4 years ago was talking to another gentleman I know that works for that department. Group was talking about me, and they were wondering, the guy said, well, what's he doing here? And the gentleman I know, who was my former Kung Fu instructor, who's African-American as well as Indigenous, asked him what he meant. And he goes, well, what's he doing here? And he goes, what do you mean? And they really had a good dialogue. And then he came back the following Monday and really, going to Ann's thing about education, he went home and talked to his wife and said, you know what, my train of thinking was wrong. That was targeting and discrimination, and he apologized. In the Marines, when you're talking about stereotypes with tribes and tribes up in Bangor, when I joined the Marines, I told them I was Mohawk. Well, the next time I went in, the gunny sat me down and he said, we also know that you're Micmac, Mi'kmaq, or whatever you call yourselves. And I was like, well, I never told you that. And he's like, well, the government has everything. They have your tribal records. They got everything on you. And he goes, just so you know, we're going to call you Mohawk, because let's face it, if somebody yells Mohawk, it instills fear. But if they yell Mi'kmaq, So a friend of mine was saying, well, good for the Mohawk, but, not so much for the Micmac, which is a very proud nation with a warrior society. So there's really layers when you go down, and then you got the Hollywood stereotype So I had a faculty member come up to me a little over 2 years ago in front of a director, a manager, and a work study in another. And he's going, whoa, 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 to me at work. And two of the people walked away, and I'm looking at him like, I'm not saying anything and looking at him. And then the director said, "Do noted, inappropriate." And then he did it again. And then the director said to him again, "Do noted, inappropriate." Well, this person kept carrying on making comments to me. And then it kind of got to a point, we were setting up for an event over at Huddleston Hall with the work study student that he made comments in front of before with me. And we set them all up with all the technology and AV equipment. And then he comes up to me at the end and he's like, "Hey, sorry, I didn't bring you some scalps today." And at that point, management asked me to write a letter. So I wrote a letter to management. And I ran into a provider over at Health and Wellness who wanted to talk to me because she said that her neighbor came up who she thought was the nicest guy, who was a tenured faculty, and made nasty comments about Indigenous peoples, how that changed her perspective. And of course, it was the same person. And the interesting thing is I've guest spoke at that school. Last time I was over there, he came up to me and said, "Hi, how you doing? I just want to let you know what you do for your people is great." So did he kind of get educated and see the light? It maybe, but really, when you look at a lot of his motives seem to me that they were really driven by Hollywood stereotypes. And that kind of
it sounds like we have a bit of work to do as far as misperceptions and stereotypes in terms of Indigenous people in New Hampshire.
Absolutely, Dan. And one thing is humor. So I have a lot of people that we have a big family and we have family events. So people have come to our family events that are not Native and they're like, "We love to come to your family events because you people are so funny." And they'll comment, "We never would have thought that." So you're right on, Dan.
That's interesting. Well, I appreciate the background information that all of you have shared. You know, one of the things that when we first had the Sidor theme selected about Indigenous perspectives on sustainability, that really kind of caught my attention was the idea about sustainability. And I know quite a lot about my own tribe's perspectives on that. So I've felt this has been a great learning experience for me to kind of see through you all's lenses and get a backdrop for this. So one of the things that I want to do now is talk a little bit about the sustainability side of things and really kind of ask the question about what is the relationship between our local New Hampshire, New England, Indigenous people and the environment, and start to kind of move our conversation in that direction and think about this in the context of what are the ways that this relationship between the local Indigenous people here in New England and the environment plays out and how it's been nurtured over the millennia. And I think about this through my experiences as a tribal member, that it often emerges in the form of traditional stories that get passed between generations. Of course, many of our tribes have strong oral traditions. And these stories are maintained by knowledge keepers. And I'm thinking particularly of some of the stories that I've been exposed to as a young person, but they seem to always encode values. They encode sometimes traditional ecological knowledge as well. But either way, they all kind of tie back to the idea of sustainability. And so I want to, at this moment, take a pause for a moment and have us cue up a video of a traditional story that Anne gifted us with. And Andy, I think you're going to cue this up for us for the next few minutes.
Kwainidoba. Hello, friends. The Abenaki people have lived here in the Northeast for 12,000 years. It's a long time that an oral tradition has passed along stories, generation after generation after generation. The stories carry the beliefs and the ideas and the knowledge and the history of the Abenaki people. And part of that, the belief system, is that this earth that we live on is the mother that nourishes all of us, and that every creature that is on it has awareness and a purpose and a way to interact with one another. So on Mother Earth, there's the land and the water, and there are the rock people and the plant people, the bird people, the animal people, the human beings, the two-legged, such as you and I, and the world of spirit. And they're all interacting, interdependent, needing one another, understanding the importance of one another. The stories carry all of that information. There are thousands of Abenaki stories, but the ones that I want to share with you, or one of which I would like to share with you, is from a group of stories about a being known as Kluskabee. Now, depending on which dialect of Abenaki you might be speaking, it could be Kluskabee or Gluskap or Cowasuck or Kluskabee, or further down the coast south of us in Massachusetts, he's known as Moshop. And over the western part of Abenaki territory toward Vermont, he's called Ochiozo, he who shaped himself. And even further out west, where our Anishinaabe cousins are, he's called Manaboso. But Gluskap is a being of such wonder that the stories were also wonderful. And they moved and traveled with the Abenaki people and were shared with everyone that they traded with. Now, Kluskabee is an amazing being. He's not human. He's also not Double Dock, the owner creator. It's said that when Double Dock had made creation and was dusting off the dust that was left over from creation, the dust hit the earth and started to swirl and shape itself. And it shaped a head and a torso. And there's a whole story about eventually he shaped his arms and his legs and became whole and went walking around creation with the Gitchimanitu, the Great Spirit, the Double Dock owner creator, enjoying the beauty of everything. Now, because Kluskabee is one who made himself, he didn't have parents. And so Double Dock gave him a grandmother to help him learn what he needed to know about the world. So he made a lot of mistakes when he was young because he had to learn so much as he went along. And, what he had to do with those mistakes is what you have to do, learn from them and do better next time. But I love the stories of when he's very, very young. So I'm going to share one of those with you now. It was a beautiful blue sky day, and Kluskabee decided that he was going to go hunting. So he went into the lodge where he lived with his grandmother Woodchuck. She was busy in there. She had all of her supplies around her, and she was getting ready to be very, very busy that day, making things, mending things. And he said, "Grandmother, I'm going to go hunting." And she said, "Grandson, good idea." So he took his quiver of arrows and his bow. He left their lodge and headed across the clearing and towards the woods. He was a very young hunter. He's not terribly experienced, so he made a lot of noise on his way out toward the woods. And the bird people and the animal people heard him, and they hid. So Kluskabee got into the woods, and he made his way in for quite a while. He couldn't find anyone to hunt. And eventually he came to a large clearing, and he was looking around, scanning, trying to find somebody to hunt. And he started to hear laughter. And that's when he realized that the bird people and the animal people knew that he was hunting, and they were hiding from him. Well, he was going to have to try something different. So he turned around, went back out of the woods, crossed the clearing, back to the lodge where he went to live when he lived with grandmother Woodchuck. That stick was back across the doorway, saying she was busy in there, but he just knocked it to one side. Went in, Grandmother, I've been hunting all morning, and the bird and animal people, they're laughing at me, and I need help. She looked up from where she was working, and grandmother Woodchuck said, "Grandson, what do you need?" And he thought about it, and he said, "I need a game bag." "I'm busy here." "Oh, grandmother, please, I need a game bag. Please make one for me." Well, he kept asking and begging and pleading and wheedling, and finally she said, "Oh, grandson." So she looked around and she found a hunk of moose hair, and she twined it out and she wove it. She got a good sized piece of fabric and she folded it over and bound it off around the edges, put a strong carrying strap on it, and she gave it to him. He took it and he looked at it. "Oh, grandmother, this is a fine game bag." And then he threw it on the floor of their lodge. "But it's not what I had in mind. Make another one for me, grandmother." "Grandson, what do you want?" I don't know, but make another one for me. Make another one." Well, she looked around and she found a big hunk of elk hair, And she spun it out, she twined it, and she wove it, and she made a big piece of cloth, and she folded it over, and she bound it off, and she put a strong carrying strap on it, and she gave it to Kluskabee, and he took it. Oh, grandmother, this is even stronger and bigger and more finely woven than the first one. What a fine game bag. Then he threw it on the floor of their lodge. But it won't do. Make another for me, grandmother. Grandson, what do you want? Well, I think it should be made of woodchuck hair. Oh, I understand, grandson. And Grandmother Woodchuck started to pull the fur from her very own belly until she had a little pile of fluff. And she twined it out, she wove it, she folded it over and bound it off, put a carrying strap on it, and she gave it to Kluskabee. It was really small. And he took it and he looked at it. Oh, grandmother. This is exactly what I wanted. Oleoni. Thank you, grandmother. And he put the bag on his belt, grabbed his quiver of arrows and his bow, and left the lodge. He knew, because she put her very self into it, that this bag would have power. Well, he went across the clearing back towards the woods, and then he remembered that the bird and animal people knew he was hunting, and he was going to have to come up with an idea how to trick them. So he got to the very clearing where he'd heard them laugh, and he started to cry. Oh, it's terrible news. The earth is ending. It's just going to fall apart, and my animal friends and my bird friends are just going to fall off. And he looked around. Well, pretty soon the bird and animal people heard him. They said, oh, the world's ending. What are we going to do? What are we going to do? They didn't know. They were panicking, and they came running out. They forgot to be afraid of Kluskabee. Kluskabee, you have to help us. The world is ending. You got to keep us safe. How can you help? And he said, well, I have a game bag here. I know it's really small, but it's special. My grandmother made it for me. And I'm going to put it down on the ground and open it up. And all you have to do is get in the bag. And when you're all in there, I will pick it up and I will keep you safe when the world ends. Oh, hey, they all agreed Kluskabee would do that for us. What a good friend you are. And so the snake slithered into that bag, and the rabbits hopped in, and the deer bound in, and the bear lumbered in. The birds flew in, and pretty soon every creature in the woodlands was in Kluskabee's bag. He looked around to make sure he got everybody, and he bent over, he cinched up that bag and hefted it up on his shoulder and said, supper time. And he turned around, went out of the woods, back across the clearing to the lodge where he lived with Grandmother Woodchuck. That stick was back across the doorway, saying she was still really busy and didn't want to be disturbed, but he just knocked it to one side, went running on in. Grandmother, you will not believe what I have done. Look. And he put the game bag down on the floor, and there are like little things pushing out the sides of the bag, and she looked at it, and she looked at him. Grandson, what have you done now? And he told her. He told her everything. How he got all the animals and he tricked them and the bird people into the bag. He said, now, whenever we're hungry, all I have to do is just reach in and grab someone, and I'm never going to have to hunt again. He was so happy. And Grandmother looked at him and looked at the bag, and she said, grandson. So you say you got all the bird people and all the animal people? You didn't leave anybody behind? He said, no, grandmother, I got them all. They're all in there. I'm never going to have to hunt again. And grandmother looked at him and looked at the bag and said, grandson, if you have all of the bird people and the animal people in your bag, and there are none left out in the woodlands, well, what are your children going to eat? And what are your children's children going to eat? And he hadn't thought about that at all. Oh, grandmother, I understand. And he bent over and he cinched the bag tight and he hefted it up and he went stomping out of their lodge, trudging his way across the clearing. And he was partway across, and then he remembered that he had tricked the bird people and the animal people, and he didn't really want them to know he had tricked them. So he came up with another idea. And when he got into the woods, into the very clearing where he had fooled everyone, he put the bag back down on the ground. He opened it up and he stepped back and he said, "It's all right. The world ended, but I put it back together. You can come out now. You can come out." Well, the birds flew out and the bears lumbered out and the deer bound out and the rabbits hopped out, the snakes and slithered out, and they all went to their homes. Kluskabee, what a fine job you did. Whoa, this looks wonderful. But when they looked really closely, they realized that their homes hadn't changed at all. And that's when they knew Kluskabee had tricked them. So they say that that's why from that day until this, in the time of year when it's time to hunt, if a hunter goes out into the woods, even where no two-legged has ever been before, and takes his game bag and puts it down on the ground and opens it up and steps back, not one bird or animal from the entire woodlands is going to get into that bag, because they remembered what happened so long ago when Kluskabee tricked them. And that's how that story ends, and that's where my story camps. Ho, hey.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much, Anne, for that, for gifting us for that story. I think that's a beautiful narrative of the intersecting that happens in so many Indigenous stories, framed around the theme of sustainability. Trickery sometimes seems to pop up a lot in these stories. Honesty, humility, family, community. I especially, as an animal biologist, I'm especially like the fact that animals play such an important part in so many of our Indigenous stories. And I know in our Cherokee creation story that there's a whole host of animals, and the one that plays the most important role is the most diminutive of all of them, the water beetle. And so I think in that story, like in the one that you just shared with us, sustainability and respect for the land are kind of central defining elements. And so I think we'll return back to the panelists again with a few questions. And I'm going to start with Paul. And I'd like for you to think about and maybe share with us today how you think Indigenous knowledge is relevant to the idea of sustainability.
Thank you. Indigenous sustainability and living within the natural world of Earth Mother has always been a way of life for us. That concept of us being the caretakers for Mother Earth has never been forgotten. We only take what we actually need and always leave enough of the other life forms to survive as well, because our continued survival depends on their sustainability and survival as a species. From the beginning of time, paleo ancestors were hunters, fishermen, gatherers. And their basis of their foodways and survival was based on seasonal changes, established patterns of foodways and other things. The migration of animals and fish were very predictable, as well as the seasonal reoccurrence of foods, medicines, plants, tubers, roots, berries, and nuts. For example, in the earliest days of our existence, thousands of years ago, the migration of caribou herds from fall mating locations in the north to spring calving location in the south allowed us to be in place when these herds came by for specific times and places to establish hunting camps. We only harvested the weak or the male adults after mating. Seldom do we ever take females that were in the breeding phases of their lives. The same was true for fishing. Most fish from the earliest times migrated from to and from the fresh waters to salt water. In the course of their migrations, natural restrictions were always in place. Waterfalls and rapids meant that fish species were slowed as their journey upstream occurred. Based on generations of observations, Indigenous ancestors of ours, we identified specific locations and migrations of where we could get the most opportunistic locations to fish for them. In many cases, we built weirs of stones and sticks to direct the flow of migration for these fish so we could harvest them more efficiently. In these locations, we often established fishing and fish drying camps. Again, we only took what we could eat fresh or processed by smoking and drying. That was until the colonial dam building phase disrupted all of these migrations. Likewise, migratory birds had a distinct pattern of migration and feeding. We often cleared forest spaces to allow the development of food sources such as berries and fruits to attract these birds. One documented case in point was the establishment of places for passenger pigeons to feed. This relationship of passenger pigeons and their migration lasted for many generations. Flocks of millions and millions of these birds made up another important and predictable food resources. That lasted until colonial overharvesting made them go extinct in the early 1900s. About 2,000 years ago, when we started to develop agriculture as a means to supplement our hunting and gathering ways, we often looked at the wetlands, swamps, and other floodplains as our gardens. Again, our agricultural practices were sustainable and environmentally sound. We often used waste fish byproducts for fertilizer. The plants that we primarily cultivated were the squash, beans, and corn, all of which worked together successfully. The squash thorny vines protected the other plants from being eaten by animals and also collected water. The beans grew up the corn stalks for support, and the three sisters were all happy as one unit. We even figured out how to plant using small stones to absorb solar heat, like a passive solar, to further heat the growing mounds so plant growth would be encouraged. These practices illustrated a true understanding about the environment and sustainability. We often consider what the colonial foodways were like in the Europe in the 1600s. Water, land, and most life forms were the property of the royals. The fact that land ownership was by the royals made agriculture very highly controlled and not for the benefit of the actual farmers. When these colonial farmers came to our lands, they saw unlimited resources with little oversight by those foreign and distant royals. The only thing that they saw was that there was the gift of God given to them, the chance to own their own land, to harvest the natural resources as they wanted. To kill a royal deer in Europe would have been a serious offense. But here in Nandakina, the deer, like most other animal food sources, was considered unlimited and beyond the control and ownership of the royals. One case in point was the near extinction of the European beaver and the creation of the North American fur trade. This global trade and uncontrolled harvesting of the American beaver had dire consequences to our long sustainable foodways and created an environment of intertribal competition for these resources. Beaver ponds started to disappear, as well as aquatic life that it supported. One interesting fact is that in 1957, Helenet Silva wrote a history of the New Hampshire game and fur barriers for the New Hampshire Fish and Game Department. The first section of the book illustrated and followed the indigenous practices of our ancestors. As such, it helped establish the concepts of hunting seasons and harvesting limits. So again, we observe the benefits of our indigenous ancestors and us, the continued caretakers of our Earth Mother, for a long-established practice of sustainability and a protection of the environment, the natural world, the waters, the land and air, and we continue to practice and protect ourselves and all other life forms in this way.
Thanks, Paul. I mean, you've given us a lot to think about there. I'm sure that the Q&A window is probably firing up right now as we speak. I appreciate all the comments about the ties, kind of the Abenaki ways with sustainability, with traditional ecological knowledge, food sovereignty. I think that those are all super important points that you touched on. I appreciate you sharing that and capturing that in your comments. I think I'm going to ask a question of Anne at this point. So, and again, thanks for your poignant story of Kluskabee and the game bag. So along those same lines, what types of indigenous knowledge about sustainability and stewardship can be found in Abenaki stories, and even more so in the methods of sharing narratives like that?
Well, there are so many different kinds of stories. You know, the story that I told is a very traditional lesson story. And there's a whole body of stories about Kluskabee that are, I think, very much teach about the interrelationship with the environment. And the Kluskabee and the game bag story that I told is one that's very, very well known. And sort of in that that genre of Kluskab stories, there's one about Well, there's one where Kluskabee defeats the water monster. Water monster's trying to hold and hoard all the water and builds a big dam. And, you know, Kluskabee's learning and actually is the one who defeats the water monster and releases the water so that it can be available for everybody. And Kluskabee makes mistakes too. There's one where he's young and he gets annoyed because the wind is blowing so hard that it's interfering with his ability to paddle his canoe to go hunting or swimming or fishing or whatever he was going to do that day, but it was in his way. So he asked his grandmother, you know, where does that wind come from? And she told him the wind eagle causes it. So this long story, I'm short, he finds this wind eagle, tricks him, binds him up, and leaves him hanging in a crevice in the rocks. And by the time he gets back all the way back to where the shore was, and the wind had stopped and it was hot and he was sweaty and the waters were starting to kind of like get stale and foam over. And so what he learned was that the wind is very, very important. It's part of this whole water and wind cycle, you know, and there's a lesson to learn. There's another where he teaches the people the proper way to harvest the sap from the maple trees at one time of the year, and very, very hard to create the maple syrup, maple sugar that was the one source of sweetener that the Abenaki had. But in the story, you know, he came across their village and there was nobody working. There was nobody in sight. And he heard this strange slurping sound. And he found everybody in the village had tapped a maple tree. And that time, pure maple syrup was flowing from the trees. And so they were just lying there, you know, getting absolutely sugar high and then, you know, sort of just falling asleep from the amount of sugar in their systems. And then he taught them that that's not going to be good and how to fix it. Kluskabee did so many things. He was involved with the changes of the season. He tried to the winter would not leave, and Kluskabee tried to defeat winter, and winter would not leave the Northland. So it was snow all the time. And so Kluskabee enlisted aid. He looked for you know, an ally. He rode on the back of a whale down to the south where summer lived all the time and brought summer back. She defeated winter and only lets winter come back one part of the year, and summer comes back for a few months every year, you know, to create the change of seasons we have. So these stories were means by which to teach all about seasonal cycles, the relationship between human beings and the earth and the waters, and how to, you know, live in balance with them. And sometimes stories were really, really informal. I mean, I can remember my mother telling me, you know, as we were actually driving down to Massachusetts to visit my grandparents, there's always a long drive, and she'd point out in the early spring, see those white flowers there? When nothing else was in blossom yet. She said, that's shadbush. And I was like, great, what's shadbush? And she said, oh, well, when that blossoms, that's when the herring are swimming upriver to spawn. You need to know about that. And then my grandfather every year would take me to this place in Middleborough, Massachusetts, where the herring were coming up to spawn. It was actually still a really, really well-known place. But now I can't drive anywhere in New England in the springtime without remembering my mother and my grandfather and finding out that shadbush is actually also called serviceberry, and it's part of our food system too. So, you know, there's just so much to be learned about how to interact with the world. And these stories were told in community. The communities were intimate, you know, our immediate family or our immediate village. But nowadays, our communities have expanded. It's not only our families and our immediate communities, but also now it's our state, it's our nation, it's our world. You know, we've expanded with immediate communications like the one we're using this evening, so that we have to take a worldview and really understand that Mother Earth isn't just our little piece of Mother Earth. It is all encompassing, and she is dependent on us as we are dependent on her. And I think maybe we're a little bit more dependent on her. We've got to take good care of it if we want to still be around. And the stories contain, you know, all the pieces of that knowledge, but they also contain the value systems. You know, there's a story that I learned about the doll with no face. It's telling about why cornhusk dolls never have facial features. And in the story talks about the spirits, the the corn and the beans and the squash and the spirits of those, and how those foods are grown together in interplanting for companion planting, but also the spirit of the corn wanted to do more and offered part of herself to make these corn husk dolls. But the bottom line of that story is that the doll acted up. It became vain, and it stopped doing what it was supposed to do, which was keeping the children safe and telling them stories and teaching them dances and teaching them songs and keeping them occupied while their parents and grandparents got things done. That doll became much more concerned with its appearance than in what it was supposed to be doing. And so the message in that story is that how we are and how we interact with other people, and that wider concern, is of much more value than how we just appear or try to make ourselves appear, or sort of that egocentric perspective. We have to turn out and be of service. So, the stories carry not only practical knowledge about how to interact with the world physically, but then also that set of value system, what it is that the community understands is important as a community, which is service beyond the needs of self, to take into consideration the needs of the greater needs, the greater good.
I think that's a great way to think about it. And I kind of boiled this down to a comment you just made a moment ago about the stories being the platform for wisdom, and the collective wisdom of the community being rolled into these stories. And you mentioned a practical aspect of a story with the serviceberry and the herring. And we have a similar kind of analog to that in the Cherokee too, where there's a particular spring blooming tree, the redbud, that blooms at the same time that the sand bass run in the spring. And that's a special time for harvest during that time of year. So I appreciate your comments on that. And of course, I think we all have come to realize that stories resonate with people too. I mean, we think of Indigenous people and oral traditions being some sort of lesser thing than a written tradition, but for most people, it's the story that resonates more so than maybe just something that we happen to pick up and read. And the most powerful reading we have really is we reconstruct it as a story in our head. So again, thanks for sharing that story with us. Denise, I have a question I'd like to ask you about kind of the same line of discussion of environmental sustainability, but in what ways do you think that environmental sustainability in New Hampshire is tied to cultural sustainability as well?
To me, they're one and the same. Indigenous culture and lifeways are directly tied to our environment and our environment protection and sustainability. Indigenous environmental awareness ensures resource preservation and ensures the survival for the future generations. However, with the contemporary practices currently in effect, people don't seem to pay much attention until something is critically endangered or completely lost. As an example, let's focus on the materials used for the art of basketry. It's a subject near and dear to my heart. One of the first stories that children learn is the creation story. In that story, it tells us how after a few tries, creators made us out of the ash tree. From that same ash tree, we were gifted the art of basketry. So since before the beginning of time, we've been taught that we are not just connected to the earth, but that she is our mother. Today, our beloved ash trees are nearing critically endangered status due to the introduction of the emerald ash borer. It's an invasive species that has swept across the continent unrestrained. With the potential elimination of the ash tree, all tribes along the northern US border could be facing the extinction of ash basketry, and in many ways, a bit of ourselves as we know it. Sweetgrass is another material tied to basketry in our ancient stories. Through development, we have lost many of our ancient gathering places. The few places of sweetgrass that still remain naturally are kept secret and are still traditionally maintained. Over time, we have been successful in developing ways to cultivate and maintain sweetgrass gardens to help ensure the survival of the plant and our ancient traditions. The white pine is our namesake, and the white pine needle is probably the most readily available and widely abundant basket material available today. We really pray and hope that that continues. With the environmental changes, the birch bark trees used for baskets and canoes struggle to grow large enough anymore for canoe use. And the mild winters prevent the bark from the smaller trees from becoming thick, which produces a thinner and weaker basket. The moose and porcupine are used to decorate birch bark baskets. The moose population in New Hampshire has been decimated by climate change and the exploding tick population. We're fearful of what's going to come to them if people don't change their hunting habits. People are using Roundup and other pesticides to eliminate what they consider to be weeds. These plants supply many indigenous medicines and give us dyes for our baskets and clothes. Plants like goldenrod is used for yellow, pokeberry for a bright pink, and black walnut for shades of browns. The toxins left behind by these weed killers contaminates the soil and insects, which in turn poisons the birds and other wildlife. This cycle of destruction echoes our teachings of cause and effect, or action and reaction, and why great care is taken with every decision. We're affecting the ability for life and for future growth as we are behaving now. Because of our current questionable environmental policies and the continued introduction of invasive species to the continent, we're currently looking at various new natural materials, including recycled materials that could be used to maintain these ancient traditional values, teachings, and art forms to ensure their continuation for the next generation. However, they will not be as creator intended.
Thank you for those comments, Denise. I think that the examples you provide are very poignant in terms of how the connection between cultural sustainability and environmental sustainability are inseparable. And I appreciate the examples of that you point out. I've got a question here I'd like to ask James. And James, can you think of, or do you feel like local non-Indigenous communities have already learned from Indigenous inhabitants in this region with respect to techniques or approaches for sustainability?
Yeah, you know, growing up in Newmarket and being related to the Chicks, they still have the wares down there, and it's right in the Lamprey River. It's, you know, when we talk about, you know, my Uncle Wilford and Adolphe Doucette and managing that and being, you know, really a traditional Swampscott, you know, Newmarket town, and actually having that traditional fishery wares there, to me, is just amazing. And it really shows the value of really Newmarket was Newmarket, and a market open to the whole region, with the tribal, between different tribal nations, as well as European settlers. And really, with a lot of the teachings you know, Paul alluded to it, and Denise as well, as really having regulations, the proper way about respect of our brother and sister animals. And there's the 3 R's that we go by: respect, reason, and responsibility, that we can show to each other, to our brother, sister animals, to Mother Earth, to Grandma Moon, to the elements, earth, water, fire, air. And these teachings, and I work with the Fish and Game on protecting endangered species, and a scientist down in Massachusetts on a certain really critical endangered species, and alluding to lessons that have come from it is in my family as well. Lots about balance, and we all need balance in our lives. We need balance within our communities. We need balance within Mother Earth, and is really looking at, you know, a family tradition is hunt, grow a garden of herbs, fish, right? And or raise chickens or, you know, cattle. And my family does all that. People in my family are doing pretty much one of those things, and really be thankful, you know, and be thankful, and giving thanks is a big thing as well, is giving thanks for all that we have, and the respect of that is going to make that sustainable. And the teachings, and one thing that I would really love to see is the New Hampshire Wabanaki people be recognized through the state and be able to really take things to another level. Because Dan, with a number of different tribal nations around Turtle Island, there's so many gifts that everybody, we're all children of Mother Earth, that we can all benefit and learn from. And I really pray that within this region and with the people of the Dawn, that really comes to fruition and grows.
That's a great point. I appreciate your comment about being thankful. This is certainly timely, given the time of year for us here. Your comments about balance and the challenges associated with that, especially in the current crises that we're facing in healthcare and in the environment. So I appreciate your comments. Kathleen, I want to toss a question your way before we get into some of the questions from the audience today. Is there something in particular that you would hope that everyone takes away from the discussion that we've had here in the panel today?
Thank you, Dan. Yeah, there's quite a bit, actually. If you look at the history of the Indigenous people of this nation, we were always environmental stewards, and we still are. If we could rise above thinking about environmental stewardship as a partisan issue, that would be a wonderful thing. Because as I used to teach my students when I was a science teacher, we are all connected. And when I say that, I don't only mean we are all connected as human beings, although I do mean that, but we are all connected to this earth and to all the beings on this earth. We're connected to the earth herself. We're connected to the waters. And it's really important that we begin to recognize that and to lead a life that nurtures and stewards this earth. Another point that I think I should make is that we are all downstream. People used to say, oh, it'll wash away. I'll throw it in the river. It'll wash away. It'll be gone. It goes nowhere. It's still here. We have to be more cognizant of pollution, of what we do to the earth. I would invite each of you to look in your garage. What do you have in your garage? Do you have Roundup sitting there on your shelf? Get rid of it. There are natural ways of dealing with things that we use chemicals and pesticides for. And it would be best if we all did this. It would solve a lot of problems. What about things that damage the pollinators? Do you sprinkle herbicides, pesticides on your lawn so that the bees are dying? Because if the bees dies, we're gonna as well. It's so important. I would urge each of you to grow something that's indigenous to this area. You can readily Google to see where plants originated. And whether you have a garden of your own or not, you can grow something in a pot. So contribute to the plant nations here. That would be helpful. What about a monoculture lawn? How much time do you spend digging up dandelions, trying to get rid of plantain, things that are actually medicines? You poison. I don't mean you individually, I mean people poison. So go ahead and mow, but why don't you just leave the dandelions there? You can use them as medicines, but many animals do as well. Learn about the plants that grow here. As other people have mentioned, many plants are medicines. You have to be really careful about that now, though, because plant medicine is strong medicine. And if you mix it with pharmaceuticals, or if you take certain plant medicines when you have medical conditions, you can make yourself very, very sick. So you would need to learn. And there is joy in learning about the beings that share this planet with us. And I would urge you to do that. One thing that I would like to leave you with is there's a wonderful book that would help you to understand our view of nature. And I think it's a really profoundly significant book. It's called Braiding Sweetgrass. It was written by Robin Wall Kimmerer, who's an Indigenous botanist, and it will help you understand a lot of things. So back to you, Dan.
Thanks, Kathleen. I appreciate that. And I appreciate your comment about growing something. Some of us are better at growing things than others, but I suppose we can all give it a try, right? I want to say thanks to all the panel members today for sharing your time and sharing your stories and your insights on this topic of sustainability today. I want to thank all of the audience who also gifted your time to come and be a part of this today. For that, I'll say Wado and thank you. Please take some time and visit the Indigenous New Hampshire Collaborative Collective website. I think we're posting that in the chat. And visit the Center for the Humanities website for information on some upcoming Solstidor series events that will be promoted soon. We'll also be posting the recording of tonight's event at these websites. I'm not sure when that will happen. It should happen soon. I want to say, again, thank you to everybody. Wish you all a great Thanksgiving holiday and stay safe and healthy until we meet again. Thank you.